And here we are. Hi,
There we
everybody.
go.
Welcome to the CXO and CHRO Walk Into a Bar. I'm Michelle Strasburger, the CEO of HR Rebooted, where we work with organizations to build intentional cultures.
I'm Dominic St. Fleur, CEO of Intramark, where we help organizations identify hidden risks like productivity gaps and unwanted turnover.
And today we're talking about, it's kind of a spin-off of last week's conversation, kind of taking it to the next level. We're talking about using soft metrics to boost valuation. So this is going to be an interesting one. I think it calls for a mojito.
That's okay. I would consider a mojito a celebratory drink.
Well, if we get a good valuation, right?
Yeah. Let's do that. What's a good celebrate? Maybe a Mai Tai. Maybe is another good celebratory drink. Maybe. So I'll go with that one. So we're all hoping for a boost in valuation, a good great exit or acquisition, or just increase in value of the company in general. So that's what we're going to be talking about today.
Go big.
I like it. But I'm super excited about this topic, Michelle. It's really talking about how do we use soft metrics to help boost valuation. I don't think there's enough attention to how soft metrics play into valuation. We're often, and we're going to define soft metrics versus hard metrics, but we're often focused on hard metrics. They're a little bit more obvious. They're a little bit more clear. In soft metrics, it's unclear on how they bleed into financial performance all the time. And so we'll dig into that. So I think, let's start with defining what are hard metrics, what are soft metrics. I'll give it a go, and then I'd love for you to expound on it. But hard metrics, very clear. They're financial and operational in nature, revenue growth, profitability, margins, if we think about gross margins or profit margins, and some operational metrics like throughput, right? We can measure these things through oftentimes systems that kind of measure that, spit it out. And they're often what is discussed in boardrooms, or it's often what's discussed with external stakeholders or internal stakeholders as well. But, typically when we're communicating to the market, we're communicating to other stakeholders, that's typically what is discussed. Any other hard metrics that I may have left, or any, do you think about it differently? And then we'll jump to soft metrics.
I think it's also what the stakeholders are looking at too, right? When you're looking at, is it profitability, bottom revenue, EBITDA, those same numbers that you were talking about that the company's looking at. I think when we think about soft metrics, we're thinking about the people metrics, the things that are harder to quantify, but that are important, but we're not always talking about them at the board conversations.
Exactly. And so soft metrics, things that are like sentiment, engagement, behaviors. And the way I like to think about soft metrics, they're typically leading indicators to hard metrics. One of the things I say, quite frequently is that nothing's free. You don't look at a soft metric, look at it's bad, and look at your hard metrics and see that it's okay. It's okay for now. And so there's usually this leading indicator with soft metrics, but unfortunately, often they really get a secondary position. And so when we're thinking about things, or and how they're collected, right? It's typically through feedback, interviews, observation that we collect these these soft metrics. And so when we're thinking about engagement, morale, and culture, really those aren't things that are typically discussed normally in those stakeholder meetings or with shareholders, but they matter quite a bit. Again, nothing's free. So if you have issues with culture, engagement, morale, but hard metrics look okay, it's probably the wrong assumption that hard metrics stay okay. Or they can recover easily if there's a little bit of a crisis. So again, soft metrics are important because often they're leading indicators to the hard metrics. And so as we're digging a little bit deeper into this conversation, we'll touch on different elements of hard and soft metrics, and who should care as well. But anything to add on the soft metrics?
Yeah, they also rise up to a level of importance when the hard metrics start to break. And so, or when there's an issue, right? When we start to see costs rising, we start to then lean into soft metrics. Where are we seeing cost? Is it cost of recruiting? Is it turnover? Is it engagement? And so when we start to see the breakdown of some of those revenue goals or the hard metric goals starting to slip, then we start to look at the soft metrics. So then they start to elevate in importance in organizations.
And what we'll get into as well is what's the missing opportunity often as well with soft metrics is not only are they the leading indicators to hard metrics often, and to your point, it's only when hard metrics start to take a hit that we start to look at other sources. What's another risk and unfortunate kind of aspect of soft metrics and how they're used is something that you mentioned during our last conversation, Michelle, is that they often get justified, right? And so the real story behind why a soft metric is, there's usually this alternative explanation for, what, and so having that accuracy to measure these soft metrics and understand the what, not just understand the what and the why behind this, behind the soft metrics are very, very important. Because you run into these scenarios where, to your point, Michelle, hard metric takes a hit, right? Company, organization misses revenue targets. And oftentimes, you'll get some leadership teams that will just say, oh, well, it's the hard economy, it's some other factor. But when you look at soft metrics, you look at, really culture and morale within the sales organization is not the best. Then you look that, well, actually you had some key turnover on your sales team, and one of which is a high producer. And so now what's being blamed or kind of explained away by, external factors are really being driven by internal factors that soft metrics kind of have a leading indicator into. And so a lot of, really addressing the justifications, but I think the opportunity here is, how do we look at soft metrics to start driving valuations, but how do we look at soft metrics as well as leading indicators before they start to show up in hard metrics? So
and I think I'm gonna do a shameless plug for you for Intramark and Vibe, because I think that's exactly what the value that Vibe does is that, if you do an engagement survey, and this is what I love about Vibe, you do an engagement survey, it's so easy for the leader to say, when HR is presenting the results, to say, oh yeah, but that's just John, right? He says that all the time. That's fine. That's just, sales, they're upset because they didn't make their numbers this quarter. That's why we're getting that feedback. With your product, you're getting the data from all different directions. So it's not just John, or it's not just sales. And I think in organizations, when we're trying to lean in to really understand the data, we can't just look at one data point, and we can't just justify it. If we're justifying it, we're not looking at the full picture.
100%. I appreciate the plug. But you touched on it, right? It's often traditional methods of measuring some soft metrics give you the what, but they don't really get into the why. And having a process that completes that, but also kind of referencing one of our earlier conversations as well, listening at the edges, right? Listening to the front line, being able to get that clear line of communication in a very efficient manner from the front line to leadership, unfiltered, is critical. And if you have that system in place, then you have early signals, leading indicators that you can get ahead of very accurately before they start bleeding into hard metrics. And so I think there's a good segue to jump into, like, who should care about this, right? Who cares the most? Who should care the most about getting this right, right? Who should care the most about, how do I use soft metrics to boost my valuation? How do I use soft metrics to get ahead, to start looking around the corner, if you will? Who should care the most? I have a view on this, and we've talked about it a little bit, fiduciaries, but how would you define a fiduciary? And are there other people that should care?
Yeah, I love that. I think we should put a stake in the ground too, that we believe that I think we are saying it in the undercurrent, but let's go bold and say that we do believe that soft metrics can boost your valuation. So saying that's the case, I think then those that should care, and I love that, there's a fiduciary, right? That you said that in our conversation earlier this week. I think that's key. And it's the person that has the most skin in the game, I think is how you defined it. And I love that. And I think as a CEO, right, that's probably the CEO, it's probably the founder. But how do you make that? Because we talked about culture last week, right? And we said that's the CEO's baby. The CEO has to own culture, right? And then leaders have to own culture. So the executive team and the leadership team has to own culture. It's not an HR initiative. And if it is, it's not going to work. And so how do you then give skin in the game to your leadership team, to your executive leadership team, to the rest of the leadership team? And I think that's something organizations have to think about, because if you want to use this as a tool to boost valuation, you have to give people skin in the game.
I like that. And, I know we're going to talk about culprits. And I think it gets a little bit more nuanced as we talk about culprits and who's a fiduciary and who are positive and negative culprits to soft metrics and how they, all of that. In 100%, fiduciaries need to care about this. And expounding on your definition is definitely the founder or a CEO. Extending to that, it's any board member, or especially the chairman of the board, but it's also a major stakeholder or shareholder, right? It's whoever is left holding the bag the most if things go wrong, or worst case scenario, the organization goes under or whatever it may be, right? It's who stands to lose the most, is how I think about the fiduciary in a way. There's a more of a formal definition for fiduciary, but the way I like to kind of think about it, at least for the purposes of this conversation, is who stands to lose the most. Whoever stands to lose the most needs to know both the hard metrics. Often they only look at the hard metrics, but they need to also know the soft metrics, because oftentimes they're leading indicators to if you're going to have some issues down the line with hard metrics. And so for me, again, it's the CEO, CFO, board member, and especially a major shareholder, stakeholder in the organization. And so as a fiduciary, right, you're gonna want systems in place, obviously, to collect hard metrics, right? You're gonna need financial reporting. You're gonna need ERP. You're gonna need different systems that are getting you this information. Often what's underinvested are systems to get you the soft metrics accurately. And so having the right systems there, because there are culprits to, boosting valuation, and there are culprits, positive and negative, to look out for. And the way that I think about culprits are they're either employees, leaders, or the environment, right? So if you look at an organization, the fiduciary also needs to be concerned about what are the employees doing, how are leaders managing, but also what is the environment. And so on an employees level, right, one thing that we talked about, Michelle, and we'll get into it a little bit, is looking at productivity. There are employees that are good at, there are good actors and bad actors in every category, right? There are good actor employees that give discretionary effort, really show up, look to move the ball forward within the organization. And there are employee bad actors that may be bad actors who are they want to coast. They intentionally want to coast and have no intentions on leaving, right? So they're coasting and have no intention on leaving. That is oftentimes some of the most expensive type of waste for an organization to have. Even more expensive than turnover is the coast, no intention of leaving. And so there's that good and bad actor there. On the leaders level, I think it's very interesting on a leadership level is, and you mentioned leaders as being fiduciaries. I'll push a little bit on that. And I say it depends, because the different types of leaders have the ability to leave with very little consequence, right? It's they can detach themselves from the organization and move on to the next role, probably get paid, paid more. But the interesting part with being in a leadership role, especially senior leadership role, is you're a steward of time and resources. But often, sometimes you'll get leaders that would openly say, I don't care, right? It's not, because they have the mentality of, it's not my money, it's not my time. And so they're not necessarily fiduciaries, but there is, oddly enough, they're stewards of those resources, right? And so if sometimes you hear a leader say, I don't really care about engagement, or I don't really care about turnover, or they give lip service to those factors, a fiduciary should really take a hard look at that, because again, it's not their time, it's not their money, but they're stewards of it. And if they're not being good stewards of it, it's nothing's free. Again, it's eventually going to bleed to the bottom line. And then the last is environment. But sorry, Michelle, you're about to say something.
I think when people say I don't care, I'm like, I just want to cringe. Yeah. I think though that's where we need to think about how do they have skin in the game, because those are the people that are impacting your productivity, your environment, and your culture the most. And those are the people that they're stewards of all of those things, as you said, and they don't care because they're not measured on it. They don't have skin in the game. And so we're going to focus our work and our efforts on the things that we're measured on. And so if we have people in soft metrics as a goal or a KPI, or maybe part of our LTIP or our stock option agreement or whatever it is, we might care a little bit more. We might have some skin in the game. But if we're only measured on revenue and cost and profitability, those are the things we're focused on.
And I like that quite a bit, right? It's making sure that incentives are properly aligned, because aligning incentives not only to metrics that are after the fact, but also metrics that are before the fact, right? So making sure that you align incentives to leading indicators in addition to the hard metrics. A lot of that holistic incentive design, if you will, is missing with a lot of organizations. Is, as a steward of resources, of time and resources, you should be properly incentivized to be judicious with both. But and it's not too uncommon where you'll get leaders that have an attitude of I don't care, right? Or it's not my money, which I've heard before. You have that, and they're right. They could leave for another organization or whatever it is. So there's nothing tying them to being held accountable, and both ways, not just quote unquote punishment, but also reward to holistically how the organization should be performing. There's often missed opportunities there. But we'll get into a little bit more in the crux of like the more tactical ways that we could think about soft metrics and boosting valuation. But I think a lot of this is setting the stage to for why this matters, who should care. But anything else to add before we maybe push a little bit more?
I do think that it's important that you think about how do you engage that leadership level, and how do you ensure that you're getting feedback as a CEO, right? If I've got 5 leaders, that's my leadership team. It's not huge. I've got a pulse on the organization and the culture, and I can go out as a CEO and talk to everybody and understand the culture. I know the players, I know the productivity, I know who's skating, I know who's my top performers, right? But as I start to grow and scale, as we talked about last week, that gets harder and harder. And you have to rely on that next level of leadership. You have to rely on your executive team. And then as you grow to the next level, you have to rely on the next level of leadership, those directors and managers, right? To be the stewards of your culture. And so I think that's a key thing. If your ultimate goal is to sell the organization or to raise money, right? So you're counting on a big valuation. This is an important piece, and I think it's key to make sure that you're engaging that level and having some system in place, as you said, to make sure that you're getting an understanding of who are the key players, who's skating and what are we doing about it, who's at risk and what are we doing about it. And AI is great for that. Some of the HR systems out there are great for that, but a lot of it is getting into the front line and having these leaders just in with the people and being able to talk to those people and having a process of gathering that feedback. At one of the companies I worked for, we did a monthly people update, and it was the executive leadership team. And we went around the table and everybody gave a people update, and they had a goal, a KPI on their metrics around people. And they had to do an update. Who are my top performers? Who's at risk? Who are my bottom performers? And what am I doing about it? And did everybody get a performance review? And did everybody get a monthly touch point or quarterly touch point, just to make sure we're having that? And what's the feedback? What are we seeing? What's the culture? Because you can't always see it as a CEO, right? That's a high expectation, I think, that we're putting on a CEO to really maintain the culture, but you have to own it, and you have to have systems in place to own it. And you've got to have, these people have to have skin in the game and a process to make sure that you're fulfilling that you have a grasp on what the culture is. So that you can't say my company's worth so much money because we have a great culture, but then they do their diligence and they do interview the HR people of this other company, go in and they do their diligence and they interview people like, no, you don't.
Yeah. And you don't want something like that smack you in the face, because it's not readily, like, it's not one of those metrics that are just like readily available, right? You have to go seek it out. You have to measure it. But you hit it on the head, right? The CEO is ultimately responsible for culture, but oftentimes it's underreported. And the risk with that is, again, not having that leading indicator, not knowing what's in the front lines. But I think what you mentioned was a great start, right? Where some organizations, report on their people and what they're seeing. However, it's something that we talked about, and I think in our last session or conversations before, is that, and even early on in this conversation, is sometimes it gets justified, right? Sometimes leaders will massage and filter, and what we discussed in our previous, CEOs are kind of like celebrities, right? They get treated like celebrities. People don't want to upset them. People, and so there's a lot of filtering that happens. So as a CEO that is responsible for culture, you're also responsible for, creating mechanisms where you can get the unfiltered truth. And so people will do what people will naturally do and position things or, massage things and filter. Because again, as a CEO or as a fiduciary, you have to remember, not, people don't approach you normally, right? People, you're kind of an internal celebrity, right? People don't want to upset you for a variety of reasons. And so making sure that to be able to see clearly around the corner, it's got to be clear data, right? But what you mentioned as far as them getting in a room and having those discussions is important step, but also having a system in place where you're able to collect this information at scale and accurately is super important.
I think that's also where the CHRO needs to step in. I think that's where the CHRO is the advisor. And like I said, they don't own culture. That's the CEO. But they need to be able to call the play, right? And if somebody is not being truthful, they need to be able to dig in and get the real scoop and get the real information and help put these systems in place to get to the bottom of the truth.
I agree. So some soft metrics that impact valuation, in my mind, and I'd love to get your thoughts, Michelle. One is productivity, and then 2 is turnover, and then 3, it's related to turnover, but I think it's worth a double click, is who's critical to retain. And so going back to productivity is one of those, and we're talking about people productivity, not necessarily like a fact, like I produce X amount of widgets productivity. We're in the people realm. But when it comes to measuring how productive people are, I think that's an extremely important soft metric that isn't always clear, or it's one of those things. Again, it bleeds in. It's a little bit mushy, but key takeaway here is it has to be inferred, right? Usually, it's one of those metrics that has to be inferred, and you have to have a clever process, to do that, which we help with Vibe, and so. But productivity or lack thereof is usually it's super expensive, and it causes bloat that's not obviously which is not obvious until it's kind of too late. And again, that employee that chooses to coast is one of the most expensive types of employees. So, for example, we had we did a campaign for a customer, and we identified one of their employees that on the surface was happy, right? So had you handed them a normal employee engagement survey, they would have been like super happy, like 95 out of 100. But our process, because we designed it the way that we did, we picked up on some signals that there's some potential disengagement. So we dug in, and we got to the root of it, and lo and behold, there was some disengagement. And so for the benefit of that employee and also for the benefit of the company, it's important to notice that and put advice in place that would ultimately help that employee, but also help the company. And the reason that that was important was this particular employee, they oversaw a critical function that the rest of the team wasn't cross-trained to handle. So had that critical function gone down, or had they not been paying attention as much, it would have been a problem, and it was 6 months later for the organization. So things were traced back to that employee that cost the organization money, and so ultimately that was bad news for everybody. For leadership for not taking action, or the employee for just not being engaged, and leadership from a financial perspective as well. And so being able to get ahead of some of these issues is super important, and oftentimes it's the leading indicators like soft metrics that help you get there.
Yeah, I think productivity can be a slippery slope too. I think you have to be careful. It has to align with the culture you want, right? You have to be careful what tools you use to measure it. I really like Agile for that, because it just creates transparency in work. Everybody knows what everybody's working on. You say what you're going to do, you either do it or you don't. And you talk about barriers, you remove barriers. It's a great process, and you can measure velocity and how quickly it takes to get work done. It's typically used within tech organizations, software development, but it's pretty transferable in other parts of the organization. But what I've seen companies do with productivity is check how many times people are keying on their keyboard or using their mouse. And that's not productivity. Me sitting at my desk in the office is not productivity, right? It's setting the KPIs and achievement of the KPIs and talking. It's not like once we get to the deadline, have I achieved it? It's having conversations throughout to remove barriers so that I can achieve it. And so I think you have to be careful. I've also found, there's other metrics that have helped or have just kind of been unintended consequences when we've improved culture, like time to fill positions, or cost of recruiting has gone down because we've improved our employer brand. Because you get internal referrals and you have people that are much more excited externally to come in and join the company. So you don't rely on recruiter fees or things like that. So those other costs have helped as well.
And on that same vein, right, it's those type of metrics that often get overlooked. So extending that exact metric a little bit further out is turnover, right? High turnover. Some organizations choose to live with high turnover. Mm-hmm. And they assume, okay, well, we're making X dollars today, we seem to be fine, but really that's a drag on the system, right? It's kind of like an airplane that is not aerodynamic, right? You're spending more on fuel, you'll get to your destination, but you're spending more doing that.
Or it's normal. It's normal for
So
our industry.
it's normal for the industry, something like that. So there are a lot of kind of, again, justifications, right? That these truisms that aren't true. But it's kind of, it's just like flying an aerodynamic plane, right? If you're an airline that flies nothing but aerodynamic planes, and there's another airline that flies nothing but non-aerodynamic planes, you'll still get there a little bit later than the other, and a little bit more expensive than the other. And so in a broader competitive landscape where those small incremental gains add up and compound, it's super important to do things as efficiently as possible. Having high turnover really means that you're really tying up your workforce in hiring and interviewing loop activities at a higher level than necessary, mm-hmm. that they could be spending innovating and doing the work and pushing the ball forward for the organization. And so spending hours recruiting and filtering to candidates, retraining candidates just to lose them, and have competency or knowledge gaps that you need filled again. And then you're taking people and you're just piling on more work on fewer people as you get that position filled again. And it's just a mess, that, again, nothing's free. That's showing up somewhere and or will show up somewhere, especially in the hard metrics. And so it's one of those other soft metrics that, in addition to productivity, having an accurate way of measuring that, but also turnover, keeping an eye on that, and especially turnover with people that are critical to retain, is extremely, extremely important, because all those activities just get compounded, once you're losing people that are critical to retain for the organization as well.
Yeah. So I want to touch on a point too. I know we're over time, but you reminded me. So, you're flying the airplane, you're going to get to the destination regardless, right? And so CEOs might be like, yeah, this seems like a big investment. Why do I have to worry about it? If I'm going to sell the company anyways, does it really matter? So I've got a couple of examples. I have a really good quote that I love to share. It's one of my favorites that I'll share in a minute. But I walked into an organization years ago, and it was a software company, and you could just feel the culture. It was so drab, and what got me excited was I had the opportunity to transform it. And so I went to the CEO and I said, we're going to change the culture. This is what we're going to do. And he looked at me, and I gave him a whole presentation, and he looked at me and he said exactly what you said in his own words, though. He said, there's all these other companies that have really horrible cultures, but they're still making multi-millions. Why do I care? And I said, yes, but the studies show, right, the companies that are on the Great Place to Work list make 5 times more. Their stock is worth 5 times more. Their revenues are 5 times more. And they've shown it year over year. And so he said, okay, whatever, go do it. And this was a multifaceted transformation. So we actually went into a new building. We got new space, new workstations. We changed the way we worked. We implemented Agile. We brought in new leadership in some of the organization, because they were working on a software that was going to take 4 years to complete. Imagine working on something that was going to take 4 years. Other than writing a book, I can't imagine anything that would take that long. Yeah. You're never going to see it done. And then we went through and we created, we were very intentional about our values. And we created some policies and programs and benefits that all aligned with that. And then about 1.5 years later, the company sold. And I say we, it wasn't me. It was a team, right? I was part of it, but it took a lot of us to get all of these because it was multifaceted transformation. The company sold for over 5 times revenue. And the CEO came to me and said, we wouldn't have gotten this number if we did not transform the culture. And so it was a key point that these soft metrics do make an impact on, and it went from one private equity to another private equity, if that's important. But it was a sale within that kind of space. And then there's another quote. I have to find it. I pulled it up here, that I really like from Heinrich and Struggle.
The example that is a perfect example, right? It's reducing that drag in the organization, really does release some value in the multiples, right? It's with soft metrics, it's hard to have that one-to-one correlation, but I think one thing that we can all agree is that nothing, again, is free. And it's about reducing that drag for the organization and getting to where it needs as efficiently as possible. So I think that was a great example.
Well, there's less work to be done, right? If you buy a house that's already all fixed up, you don't have to go in and do renovations versus a house that's falling apart. You have to go do renovations, right? Which one are you going to pick?
Yeah.
You might spend more for the one that's been redone, but you don't have to do much to it.
Yep.
So I think that translates. So the other quote that I really like to share is, it's a research from Heidrick and Struggle. They discovered an interesting subset of companies, those that approach their culture initiatives with a strategic intent. So strategic meaning this was from the CEO, right? It wasn't just something that was bubbled up from the bottom. It was a strategic initiative. Labeling them as culture accelerators, they found that these organizations followed a people-first approach across the board, and had a better financial performance than the rest of the surveyed group. They report that culture accelerator companies' compound annual growth rate was 9.1% versus 4.4%, more than double, right?
Yep.
But what's interesting, because I think people will be like, yeah, that's fine. That's probably tech companies or startups or whatever. They found that this phenomenon occurred in companies of all sizes in every sector across the globe. So it's not just something that happens with tech companies or happens with certain startups. It's those that focus on culture as a strategic initiative see the benefits of it.
Yeah. And again, it's hard to imagine that there aren't benefits. It's the when we talk about the house, it's really making sure the incentives are aligned, and inclusive of the soft metrics, again, because they're leading indicators, but also soft metrics should be more discussed, or discussed more, in those stakeholder meetings, in those, meetings with external parties and shareholders or stakeholders that are, and fiduciaries, right? So a fiduciary needs to be aware of how these soft metrics impacts the organization, because again, nothing's free.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Good talk again.
Yeah, absolutely. This was a super important topic, and it's just something that is a little bit more overlooked than it should be. But there's a lot of values to be unlocked.
Yep. And next week we're going to talk about restructuring without losing trust. So tune in for more.
Thank you so much, Michelle.
Thank you, everyone.